Alcatraz, a high-security prison built of concrete and steel on an island surrounded by the frigid waters of San Francisco Bay.
This was extreme. No prison in the world that had the type of security that we had here.
For almost 30 years, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was the country's toughest prison, a living hell for high-risk and high-profile troublemakers. Men like Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and the Birdman, Robert Stroud.
The purpose of Alcatraz was actually to completely isolate some of America's worst. If you broke the rules or broke the law, you went to prison. If you broke the rules in prison, you came to Alcatraz.
It's a prison where every inmate learns one thing. There is no way out.
Just 4 hours after one of the most daring breaks in the history of the Dallas County.
1933, America is in crisis. The Great Depression and Prohibition unleash a massive crime wave. Criminal syndicates rule the big cities, and gangsters and hoodlums are robbing banks across the country.
We should all be concerned with but one goal, the eradication of crime.
FBI Chief J. Edgar Hoover petitions for a supermax prison. In 1934, the Justice Department takes control of Alcatraz Island, a former military prison sitting just over a mile from the city of San Francisco. The goal, create a high-profile facility for the worst of the worst, the toughest of the tough. It becomes a prison that revolutionizes confinement. It aims to punish rather than rehabilitate. Some will survive using their brains or their brawn. Some will fight back, unwilling to give in. Others will break under the strain, and some will make a desperate run for freedom. The prison's first line of defense, cold steel bars. Since at least the 19th century, jails have used metal bars to hold criminals. But as long as there have been prison bars, there have been prisoners clever enough to break through them.
There's very few prisoners at Alcatraz or any other penitentiary, federal or state, that at one time or another doesn't hatch a plot to escape.
The U.S. Army first built the Alcatraz cell house as a military prison in 1909. Like other prisons of the era, Army engineers installed flat steel bars on the cells. The metal itself was strong, but no match for a standard hacksaw blade. Joe Tate is a prison equipment engineer at Southern Folger.
This gives you a nice even place to cut on, a nice flat to cut on. If an inmate takes a hacksaw to this, he'd be out in a couple of days.
When the prison became a federal penitentiary in 1934, officials gave the rock an upgrade, covering the prison with tough, tool-resistant bars that would grind up saw blades.
They've been heat-treated, and what that causes is a carbon buildup in the steel that you can't use a hacksaw to cut this with. If an inmate tries to saw through this, all he'd do is spend his years and years just grinding away.
Over the years, the tough convicts on Alcatraz try every way imaginable to break out. Most attempts failed.
This is case-hardened steel, and it's pretty near impossible to saw through this.
In 1939, one inmate attacks the bars in a unique way. Convicted gangster Arthur Doc Barker, son of the infamous Ma Barker, is a murderer, kidnapper, and armed robber. He receives a life sentence on Alcatraz. A few years later, Doc spots a way out and begins plotting his escape. He's locked up in the D-Block isolation unit. D-Block is one of 2 cell blocks federal authorities failed to upgrade with the tool-resistant bars.
The reason they didn't upgrade the entire cell house to the tool-proof steel was simply a matter of economics. This was an old, aging building, and the money only went so far in the depths of the Depression.
With a smuggled hacksaw blade, Doc and 4 accomplices saw their flat D-Block cell bars so they can enter and leave as they want, hiding the cuts with paint.
They would push them down and then were able to call through.
But Doc and his gang still need to get through the round window bars. These tool-resistant bars are much stronger than the flat bars. The tool-resistant bar is nearly impossible to saw through with a standard saw. The reason? Hardness. A tool-resistant bar has more carbon, which makes the metal harder. When a bar is heat-treated and quickly cooled, the atomic structure shifts, making it more difficult for a blade to cut.
Heat treating has been around for a long time. Any blacksmith who makes horseshoes or a swordsmith has been using it for years and years and years. Hundreds of years.
Thanks to the added carbon and heat treatment, the tool-resistant bars on Alcatraz are about the same level of hardness and strength as a hacksaw blade, the very tool many inmates would use to try to cut the bars.
Whenever one tries to cut something with a material of the same strength or less, it can't do it. It's like trying to cut concrete with concrete. You can't do it. You need something stronger.
Doc's solution is ingenious. He has other cons build and smuggle a bar spreader into the cell house, a crude mechanical device that uses pressure to break the bars.
A bar spreader is essentially like a car jack, and as you crank it and it opens, it's going to put an enormous amount of force on the bars and spread them. They would break because they're fairly brittle compared to mild steel.
January 13th, 1939. Doc and his 4 accomplices slip out of their pre-cut cells and snap the window bars with the bar spreader. Now, outside the cell house, they head to the water and begin building a driftwood raft. Suddenly, guards spot them. Shots ring out, and 4 of the 5 men surrender. But it's too late for Doc.
Doc Barker was shot in the head. He did not make it.
The escape attempt is a tragic failure, but Doc and his associates found a way through the maze of cell house bars. Nearly 24 years later, a determined inmate devises another clever way through the bars.
He was very ingenious in that he used some very simple tools to effect his escape.
John Paul Scott is a convicted armed robber with a troubled history. 3 years after Scott arrives on the Rock, he is working in the Alcatraz kitchen basement. Luckily for Scott, security there is looser than in the rest of the prison.
Down in the kitchen basement, they had a certain amount of time where they can work the bars.
For a few minutes every day, Scott heads to the basement with a variety of tools, including a simple piece of string dipped in floor wax and covered with scouring powder. He methodically saws at one of the window bars. It's a brilliant use of available materials. It takes him more than a year, but he finally cuts through the bars. On December 16th, 1962, Scott and an accomplice, Darryl Parker, make their way through the window and down to the water with another simple tool, rubber gloves. The 2 men make floats and set off from Alcatraz. Parker doesn't get far, but Scott makes it to San Francisco, where he washes up on shore, half frozen.
The cold got to him so badly that he felt like his legs were paralyzed.
Scott was thrown back in prison, another failed attempt to break out of Alcatraz.
It was a good escape strategy, but he was hypothermic by the time he made it to shore.
John Paul Scott is just one of many who try to run from the iron grasp of Alcatraz. Escape becomes an all-consuming ambition to many of its prisoners, all of whom come to grips with its most ruthless security barrier, the freezing currents of the San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz, a fearsome concrete penitentiary with tiny cells and dozens of armed guards. One reason Alcatraz is so tough and so effective as a prison is its natural setting. The cold, inhospitable island is surrounded by miles of bone-chilling water.